Hello, and welcome to History by Hollywood, a podcast series that examines the real events and people behind fact-based movies. This is episode 44 for Sunday, the 2nd of December, 2018. And today's movie is 1998's Elizabeth, starring Cate Blanchett in the title role. It's directed by Stephen Shekhar Kapoor. My name is Andrew Blischik, and with me as ever is Martin Darlington. Hi, Martin.
Hello, Andrew. Hello, everybody. I do have to, before we go into the main bit of the intro, just hats off to Andrew, who's done absolutely the lion's share of all the work on this. I've watched the film and made a couple of comments about it.
That's okay.
Just been home for the daughter's 18th, which involved advice on hangover cures.
There you go.
So, errata and updates. A friend of the show, Ben Robertson, wrote in pointing out from Catch Me If You Can that my pronunciation of the New York airport LaGuardia is LaGuardia, not, as I said, LaGuardia. Ben also asked if we're still planning to cover 13 Days, the Cold War movie that came out in the 80s, I think.
I think so.
Late 80s, early 90s.
Kevin Costner.
The answer is definitely yes, we are. In fact, we will drop that into the planned episodes list on the next update, which will probably hit the website planned episodes page just after the new year. In further news, you and Janine are about to relocate back home to Australia. In fact, by the time our dear listeners hear this, you will be back in the lush countryside of
Melbourne suburbs.
Yeah. So we're going to have to do our recordings via Skype, so the sound quality may change somewhat, although we hope it doesn't deteriorate, and there should be less feline sound effects going on in the future.
You're not suggesting that we'll be moving to Melbourne and there won't be any cats in our life? That there will be at our end?
I did, when I was writing that, I thought, that's a pointless thing to say. There's probably going to be more.
We do have 10 days when they're in quarantine where we'll be cat and dogless. So
there we go. We'll try and get the next 3 or 4 shows in during that period. To that end, Andrew's going to have to buy some software and a studio mic. We both happily accept that we're never going to make any money out of HBH. We've never had that as an ambition, but there are costs to meet. And if anyone feels like dropping us $1 or $2, that would be very welcome indeed. If you visit the website at historybyhollywood.com and go to the About page, you'll see a Buy Now button, which really should have been changed to Donate by now. But in the early days, doing that defeated us, and now we just like it because it's a little bit quirky. So if you click on that and drop us a few coins, anything is very, very welcome indeed. So thank you.
Thank you. A review. We've got a comment from a user whose handle is REV, the number 9, then EW.
No, that's me misspelling review.
Oh, there you go.
The handle is either Kinhutch or
Oh, that's right. I see that now. I wonder what the review is about.
Hutch.
CYN Hutch, yes, thank you. He says about our show.
Could be
thank
Cynthia.
You. A listen for history buffs and movie buffs. I just listened to my first episode, Abdul and Victoria, and I was entranced, educated and entertained. I can't wait to explore the rest of the episodes. Thank you for your podcast. And thanks to you, Sin Hutch, for succinct and very encouraging review. It really is a boost for us to know that we're hitting the right notes with some of our listeners, and we're always grateful for any feedback about improving the show.
Yeah. And speaking of feedback, Phil Pomerantz, our in-house medical consultant and another friend of the show, wrote us a long and fascinating email. Phil lives in Pennsylvania, and he was able to inform us that due to the efforts of Attorney General Josh Shapiro and his grand jury, this is obviously in reference to the last episode, Spotlight, there is now a 2-year window in the state statute of limitations during which they will be able to bring charges against priests and anyone else for child abuse whenever the crime was committed. So it's a 2-year suspension of the statute of limitations.
And then it goes back to the ridiculous...
No, I think during that period they're going to try and pass legislation to get rid of it completely. Phil also mentioned, in response to our 2 degrees of separation from Kevin Bacon comment, that he grew up 3 blocks from the Bacon family in Philadelphia and was a classmate of Kevin's older sister, although he never met the man himself. So that's 1 degree, not bad, Dr. Phil. And in a follow-up email, Phil also pointed out that Liev Schreiber, who wonderfully played Chief Editor Marty Barron in Spotlight, also plays a Hollywood fixer in a TV show called Ray Donovan, in which his background is a Boston lad who, along with his brother, was abused by priests as a young boy.
So he's invested in... That's the story, isn't he?
Wow. Yeah, that's almost like... I wonder if he hunted out that role in Spotlight. I'm not sure. Anyway, now on with the show.
First off, as always, the story of the movie. Elizabeth was released in 1998. It was directed by a successful Indian director by the name of Shekhar Kapoor, At that time, he was best known for a very successful Bollywood biopic, Bandit Queen, about the Indian bandit and later politician Phoolan Devi. Kapoor would go on to direct a sequel to Elizabeth with 2007's Elizabeth the Golden Age. He would go on to direct a few other Western movies, including The Four Feathers, which starred Heath Ledger and is set in the Sudan during the Victorian times. The screenplay for Elizabeth was written by Michael Hurst, who has recently produced, co-produced and written several historical TV shows, including The Tudors, The Borgias, Agincourt, Camelot and The Vikings. His main movie writing fame is due to these two Elizabeth movies.
So he's more TV
and
nowadays.
Producer,
yeah. Elizabeth stars Australian actress Cate Blanchett as Queen Elizabeth I during the early days of her reign. It was the role that brought Blanchett to international stardom. Her portrayal of the young Queen earned her a Best Actress Oscar nomination, which she didn't win, but she did win Best Actress BAFTA and Golden Globe Awards, plus a bevy of other lesser awards in that category. Elizabeth also stars another Australian, Geoffrey Rush, as Elizabeth's scheming right-hand man, Francis Walsingham. Rush won the Best Supporting Actor BAFTA in 1999 for his portrayal of Walsingham.
Elizabeth also stars John Gielgud, Joseph Fiennes, Richard Attenborough, and in some minor roles, Daniel Craig, pop star Lily Allen, and even French soccer legend Eric Cantona. In addition to Blanchett's Oscar nomination, the movie was also Oscar nominated for Best Picture, Costumes, Cinematography, Score, Art Direction and Makeup, and was only successful in makeup, unfortunately. Somehow it lost the Best Picture gong to Shakespeare in Love. In all, it won 6 BAFTAs in 1999. It's gorgeous to watch and the critics loved it. Currently it's got an 82% positive score on Rotten Tomatoes. It cost some $50 million to make and took over $80 million at the box office. It runs for just over 2 hours and was filmed in studios and on set in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, 80 back from 50. I mean, in terms of investment, you'd think that's a good return. Yeah, it's over a 50% profit of your investment.
But these figures that we quote, we mentioned this before, they say the box office, so that would automatically, you think, exclude the DVD sales or the video sales or the streaming costs. Yeah. So I'm sure it's seen all round as a success in popular culture, at least.
Yeah. Okay, so the synopsis and reality check. The opening scenes shows us some text informing us that it's 1554 and England's king, Henry VIII, is dead. The country is divided between Catholic and Protestant. Henry's successor, his daughter Mary, a staunch Catholic, is working to undo the Protestant Church of England work that her father implemented. Mary is without child, and the Catholic's greatest fear is that Mary will die without an heir and the crown will go to her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth. I don't know if it's worth reminding people, but Mary was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife, who he divorced, and Elizabeth is the daughter of Anne Boleyn, who he had beheaded.
And just, I suppose we're doing a reality check then of some sorts. They're missing, he did have an heir that reigned for a couple of years and then died. I don't know if it was Henry IX, but didn't Henry
No, it was an Edward, I think. Back to the movie, we see a proclamation with Mary's official seal, which then cuts to shackles and a prisoner being roughly treated, a woman whose hair and scalps, her hair's been cut off, but so brutally that the scalp's been cut. The prisoners are then taken out to their public execution. Catholic priests inform us that these 3 prisoners are Protestant heretics who were promptly set on fire. The crowd watches on and, despite the prisoners' pleas, do nothing to save them and in fact stoke the fire with more fuel. Just to round up reality, Catholics burnt Protestants, Protestants burnt Catholics. It was a pretty nasty time in England's history.
And Mary was desperate to have an heir to prevent the monarchy going to her Protestant half-sister. That's true.
Yeah. Okay, back to the movie.
The action then cuts to the inside of the palace, and we meet the Duke of Norfolk, played by Christopher Eccleston. The palace bells are ringing to celebrate the pregnancy of Queen Mary. Norfolk asks a female informant, and likely his lover, if it's true, is Mary pregnant? The informant tells him that while the Queen is showing some symptoms of pregnancy, she and the King have not been intimate for many, many months. Norfolk then goes in and congratulates the Queen in person. The Queen's played beautifully by Kathy Burke. We learn from the Queen's advisors that there's a Protestant rebellion brewing against her, and they discuss the possible involvement of Mary's half-sister Elizabeth. Although it looks like Elizabeth has not been involved, while Elizabeth lives, she will be a lightning rod for Protestant dissent, and she should be dealt with. Mary angrily denounces Elizabeth as illegitimate and says she should never rule. Mary then tells Norfolk to find proof of Elizabeth's treachery. In the next scene, we're in the idyllic English countryside where we meet Elizabeth for the first time. She's with her entourage, who are all joined by Elizabeth's love interest, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. Elizabeth is played by Cate Blanchett and Dudley is played by Joseph Fiennes. Elizabeth and Dudley are soon alone and are getting intimate when they're interrupted by one of Elizabeth's handladies, raising the alarm that Mary's henchmen are here to arrest her, which they promptly do. On parting, Robert tries to buoy Elizabeth, saying, "Just remember who you are."
Yeah, I mean, reality on that bit, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, is a real person. He was certainly one of her favourites for all of his life.
And was a love interest,
yeah,
they say.
She was arrested by Mary. She was imprisoned in the Tower. At another stage, she was under house arrest, as it were.
Yeah, that's right.
And her communications were monitored. But if she was a knowing participant in any conspiracies, there was never any hard evidence turned up, and you could see that Mary was hesitant to take the step of actually having her sister.
So that whole scene of Mary trying to imprison, that's pretty accurate. You know?
Yeah, that's not bad.
And Elizabeth was, as best as we can tell, not part of any conspiracy.
No. Next, in the next scene, we see Elizabeth led to prison and then interrogated by senior Catholic nobles and bishops. She's accused of plotting against the Catholic faith, and she doesn't deny that she's not a Catholic, but she just says, she has nothing to do with any conspiracies, and why can two sides get so worked up about a small thing like religion, which infuriates the one-eyed bishop. There is no confession, and Mary is led to Elizabeth's cold prison cell. Elizabeth is led to a cold prison cell. One of her captors offers his coat to Elizabeth. She eventually takes it, saying she will remember such kindness.
Next, we briefly see a distraught Mary. Something's up. We think maybe has she lost the baby. Before we learn what's going on, we see Elizabeth taken from her cell in fear of her life. She is driven to the palace, past a riotous mob. Elizabeth enters Mary's chambers, offering her services to her queen, her half-sister. Mary then accuses Elizabeth of treachery, and we learn that Mary is not pregnant, but instead has cancer and will likely die soon.
Madam, you are not well.
They say this cancer will make you queen, but they are wrong. Look there, it is your death warrant. All I need do is sign it.
Mary, if you sign that paper, you will be murdering your own sister. You will promise me something? Mm-hmm. When I am gone, you will do everything in your power to uphold the Catholic faith. Do not take away from the people the consolations of the Blessed Virgin, their Holy Mother. When I am queen, I promise to act as my conscience dictates.
She does
not
agree.
say, no, I will.
I'll protect the Catholic faith in any way. Elizabeth is sent back to her home this time to be under house arrest until Mary recovers. So she's out of the cell and gone to her house, On her way out of the palace, Elizabeth walks through a noisy room crowded with Mary's Catholic court. They all fall silent in the company of this Protestant princess. Once she passes, but still within earshot, Norfolk appears, and he berates them all, saying, "She's just a child, and still you piss yourselves." This amuses Elizabeth, who's starting to realise what power she would have should she become queen. Norfolk then learns that the militant Protestants in the country are stirring on the news that Queen Mary is unwell, and these Protestants are led by one Lord Walsingham. This news angers Norfolk, who proclaims Walsingham is nothing.
Yeah, I mean, Walsingham was, he wasn't entitled at that stage. I think he was the son of a lawyer. He studied law himself. But when Mary came to the throne, like a lot of ardent Protestants, he fled to Europe, and he was in Papua in Italy. He's fluent in Italian and French. Just a quick wrap up on the reality as well of the Duke of Norfolk. I mean, the Dukes of Norfolk, through history, have traditionally been Catholic, and they actually survived centuries of Protestant monarchs. So, I mean, since Henry VIII, since Queen Mary, we've not had a Catholic king or queen. And they did so by being very good at,
loyal
diplomacy and warfare, and being very loyal. Ironically, this Duke of Norfolk was actually raised a Protestant, even though he's from a strongly Catholic family, but he had strong sympathies with the Catholics. And
they're saying here he's the main protagonist, trying to ensure the Catholics regain the crown.
He's definitely competent.
Yeah, there you go. And the other thing too, the reality check, Mary thought she was pregnant, remember, and it turns out that she announces that it's cancer of the ovary and she's going to die likely soon. That's sort of true. Mary did have 2 phantom pregnancies. Twice she convinced herself that she was pregnant. She stopped menstruating and all sorts of things like that. And all symptoms were there, but it turns out to have been nothing both times. It wasn't cancer that got her in the end. I forget what it was.
Edema.
Edema, which is, I don't know, it's a blood thing, I think.
Dr. Pomerantz, can you let us know what I've heard of an edema. We should have looked it up, but I've been travelling and nursing a drunk or hungover daughter, and Andrew and Janine have been packing, so this is probably the closest we've come to winging an episode. Okay, back to the movie, and in the next scene we meet Francis Walsingham, played by Geoffrey Rush. He's in a philosophical but relaxed mode, discussing God with a young friend, possibly lover, a very handsome young Italian lad. The young friend looks to be a Catholic spy though, and holds a dagger against Walsingham's neck. Cool as a cucumber, Walsingham says, "Think carefully before acting, and if you decide, do it," or something along those lines, wasn't it? The young man hesitates and just deflates in front of Walsingham. He won't be following his orders tonight, so Walsingham takes his young friend to the window and he tells him of his bright future, provided he keeps his innocence. At which point he quite calmly and brutally slits the young man's throat and watches him die. It's strange for a movie that doesn't shirk from showing people being burnt at the stake and later on being tortured. Ooh. He basically gives him a blister across it. It looks like a rope burn across his neck. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't look a particularly realistic throat cut. Not that I'm, in favour of gore, but it just seems, I don't know. It seems.
Well, they're silent on where the action takes place. They're looking out the window, and it looks very European. But you've just provided the information that it was Padua.
He was in Padua at that stage of his life, studying. I mean, this particular scene, I think, is almost certainly fictitious.
Yes.
And it's just to introduce us to Walsingham as a
ruthless.
Very calm in the face of a dagger at his throat.
Back to the movie. We're back with Elizabeth, and she's in a confessional box about to ask a priest for forgiveness of her sins. But on the priest side of the confessional box, it's her trusted advisor, William Cecil, the Baron Burghley, played by Richard Attenborough. Burghley tells her this is the only safe place that they can meet. He warns the young princess that even though the Protestant supporters are growing in number, her life is under real threat, and she's to meet with no one that might do her any harm. But he does tell Elizabeth he will arrange for her to meet the Spanish ambassador, who promptly replaces Burghley in the confessional box. The ambassador informs Elizabeth that the Spanish king is infatuated with her and that he wants in fact to marry Elizabeth. The King of Spain is of course Mary's current husband, and Elizabeth rejects this blatant move to take advantage of the young and future queen. Next scene, we're back in Mary's chambers. Norfolk is harassing the poor sick queen to sign a decree to prevent the crown falling into Elizabeth's heretical hands. And then we're back with Elizabeth discussing the marriage proposal with her lover, Dudley. Elizabeth seems to be entertaining the idea for a moment and then wrings Dudley's hands in all her confusion. In hushed tones, Dudley reminds her she'll soon be the queen with the whole nation to worship her, not just the Spanish king. Elizabeth likes that idea and they profess their love for each other.
Truth on that, well, Baron Burghley, William Cecil, played by Richard Attenborough in the movie, he looks...
Wise old counsel.
Richard Attenborough, sort of 70 or 80-year-old wise bird. He was actually in his 40s,
no,
I think.
In his 30s, early 40s. 13 years older than her, and she was 22.
So he was only 13?
She was 25, so he was 38.
All right, yeah. So much younger man.
Younger.
But if you can get Richard Attenborough into a film, I suppose you do, because he brings a certain gravitas. And although we it seems strange that a Protestant advisor would try and get her married off to a Catholic monarch, there weren't many others in Europe.
And I guess that's what was seen as expedient.
The Netherlands, this was pre the Netherlands War of Independence from Spain. They were the Spanish Netherlands at the time. And, and Cecil certainly throughout his life and the Queen's reign tried to arrange, beneficial marriages for her.
Yeah, and I had to stop and think to myself as a lapsed Catholic, does the Church of England have confessional boxes?
No.
And they might have back then, but they don't now. They do have the concept of a confession or an absolution, but that can happen to a group of people.
But it's not conducted by a priest.
Oh, it's not, and it's not.
No, they do communion.
It's not in private like a little booth either.
No. No.
So I'm not sure whether that's right or wrong.
I think we're almost coming back to Spotlight. We talked about this is the thing that the Catholic Church intercedes itself between God and humans.
Yes.
So you cannot have a direct relationship with God. You've got to go through the priest, who's the conduit, and then speaks to you back with the word of God. So, for those who believe such things. Whereas the Protestants, and Martin Luther's whole thing was, no, I can have my own direct individual relationship with God.
Yeah, so you wouldn't need for confession.
Yeah.
Come back to the movie. We see the Catholic priest performing last rites on Mary's body. So she's died, unfortunately. Norfolk takes the royal ring from Mary's hand, passes it to one of the earls, and says, "Take it to her." So we know Mary stayed her hand at any execution order, and Elizabeth will in fact be queen. Elizabeth's handmaidens gather around her and announce the earl's arrival, who promptly passes the ring and proclaims Elizabeth the queen. An emotional new queen says, "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvellous." The scene quickly moves to her coronation in Westminster Abbey. Norfolk, her Catholic antagonist, is by her side as the crown is placed on the young monarch's head.
Yeah, I mean, just a reality there. Interestingly, I think that scene where Norfolk quite coldly says to the priest, "Is she dead?"
Yeah.
"She's dead?" "Yes." "Right." Rips the royal signet ring with the seal off. But then, despite the fact he didn't want Elizabeth as a queen, accepts that it's inevitable, accepts the law and as it was then. And I think that was quite an accurate take on Norfolk.
Okay.
And then, but the movie has to compress it into 2 hours, so I suppose very quickly he's going to become not so supportive or loyal. Okay, back to the movie. We see Elizabeth getting an early briefing by her closest advisors, including Burghley, and is told that old European rivals are threatening England. The treasury is empty, so she can't raise an army. The navy is depleted. And she's also got internal enemies, including Mary, Queen of Scots. Elizabeth will only be secure once she produces an heir. The coronation night festivities take place, and there's clapping and dancing, and during the evening, a very flirtatious dance routine happens between Dudley and the new queen. She seems quite open, doesn't she, in the way she's sort of like... Walsingham has arrived, and he watches the proceedings from the wings.
Elizabeth learns through Burghley, her advisor, that he has engaged Walsingham to be her protector. As well as Walsingham, the Spanish and French ambassadors are there, as is Lord Norfolk, so there are lots of opportunities for intrigue. Elizabeth meets the French ambassador, played by football legend Eric Cantona, who promptly offers up the king's brother to be Elizabeth's husband. So she's had the King of Spain and the brother of the King of France offered to her in pretty much the same day. The suddenly savvy Elizabeth says it's a shame the French king's aunt is causing mischief in Scotland at the head of some French troops, and that's Mary of Guise, which we'll meet later. Norfolk and Walsingham have a tense meeting, and the Queen picks Dudley as her dance partner. They all watch on as the two wheel around each other in a steamy dance. That night, Dudley causes a bit of a frisson amongst Elizabeth's handmaidens when he arrives at the Queen's bedroom. Just as he goes in to her bedroom, Burghley arrives. The handmaidens cover for the two lovers, making excuses, and Burghley leaves. Not before he tells the ladies that he wants to inspect Elizabeth's sheets each morning so he can track what she's up to. This amuses the ladies, who then watch the two young lovers in the Queen's bed get down and dirty. Shall we do a quick reality check on that bit?
Yeah, I mean, the matter of inspecting the Queen's sheets may seem a bit intrusive, but this way the Chamberlain can ensure she's regularly experienced a period and she's definitely not pregnant,
right?
Which would be something that would need an instantly arranged marriage.
Yeah, so
with someone who's not going to ask too many questions about, gestation periods.
And during Elizabeth's life, there was all sorts of suggestions that she should marry one monarch or another to consolidate their power or the other monarch's power. But of course, she's known as the Virgin Queen and never married anybody.
I read one account, and I suspect this is one of the online things by someone who has an ulterior motive or some
conspiracy to peddle.
And she said, yes, absolutely no evidence that she was not a virgin. And yes, she did keep herself virginal. There would have been no secrets because there were always servants around. There was no privacy. And I'm thinking, yeah, Elizabeth was quite happy to chop people's heads off. If I was a servant and told, keep your mouth shut, I think I might have been tempted to keep my mouth shut.
Good point.
I find it very hard to believe that someone of her vigour and savvy and enjoyment of life would not, but maybe she just wasn't interested. It's possible. Maybe. But I think the bottom line is no one can possibly know.
That's true.
Not until we invent the time machine.
So back to the movie. It's the next morning and Norfolk rudely storms into the Queen's bedroom. He tells her to get up as there's bad news. Now awakened in front of her advisers, we learn that Mary of Guise has increased the number of French soldiers in Scotland to 4,000 or maybe more. On her first full day as monarch, she needs to respond to this new threat, or increasing threat. A belligerent monarch tells her she must raise an army and send it to Scotland. Elizabeth is hesitant, but Norfolk insists, and eventually all of her advisers, including her lover Dudley, recommend she go to war. Walsingham is there watching the egos and dynamics around him and the new Queen. When Elizabeth asks his opinion directly, Walsingham urges caution, but this is much to the annoyance of the other advisers. We don't learn her final decision immediately as the action cuts to a storm-battered castle where Elizabeth is preparing for bed. The storm continues with thunder and lightning as the scene moves to the next morning, or maybe a bit later than that, one morning, where we see a blood-soaked river and a blood-soaked field covered with bodies of dead soldiers. There are a few survivors, but they're being picked off, and the dead bodies around them are being ransacked for valuables. We see a victorious Mary of Guise appear, played by French actress Fanny Ardant. It seems Elizabeth did indeed call for a war against the French, and Elizabeth's forces, which were unprepared for battle, seem to have been comprehensively defeated. Mary of Guise spares the life of one boy survivor, and he tells him to take a written message to the Queen.
Yeah, he gives her a pennant, doesn't it? One of her pennants. So it's English blood on French colours.
Right, that's the significance.
There were various skirmishes. Mary of Guise was in Scotland.
Yes, she was.
But whether they actually, I'm not sure.
She was in cahoots with Mary, Queen of Scots.
Oh yeah, very much so.
Back to the movie?
Yep.
Okay, we're back at the palace, and a furious Elizabeth has learnt of the disastrous battle, and she's calling for her advisers, but none of them seem to be around. She storms off on her own. She's overcome by events that threaten her and her monarchy, when she suddenly sees a portrait of her father, Henry VIII. This quietens her and brings her to tears. Walsingham appears. She's initially angry at his presence, saying, why did they send children to fight and not real soldiers? Walsingham informs her that the bishops denounce the adventure from their pulpits. They don't fear her, this is the bishops, and they don't expect her to survive. Later that day, Elizabeth rides off with her entourage to find Dudley. She's angry at him, together with the other advisers, for recommending war. Burleigh and the French ambassador appear, Eric Cantona, with the news that Mary of Guise says she will not cause any more trouble to the English on the condition that Elizabeth married the king's brother.
Eventually, which is Mary of Guise's son, Duke of Anjou, I believe.
Maybe.
I think so.
That means Mary Guise would have been the queen?
No, she's the king's aunt.
Ah, right.
Right. The king's cousin is her son, I believe.
I get you. Eventually, Elizabeth sort of agrees, and she says the king's brother should now come to visit so she can meet him first. The ambassador and Burleigh watch from a distance as the Queen and Dudley are having a lover's spat. The French ambassador and Burleigh are clearly not fans of Dudley, who threatens both their plans and they're making murderous noises about him to each other.
Yeah, Burley says something like that, doesn't he? Don't worry about him. His father was a traitor, and he'll
be a traitor too. Yeah.
Or what does he say? He's likely to find his head on a spike more than on a queen's pillow.
Yeah,
which I thought was a good line,
but untrue.
Yes.
Next, we see Norfolk getting ready for the day before his lover, who remains in bed.
His lover's one of Elizabeth's waiting girls, isn't she? I think.
It?
Yeah.
I didn't pick up on that.
Yeah.
So she's got a spy in her camp.
Kind of.
Kind of. Yes. More of that later.
Yes. More of that later. He thinks he has.
Yes.
Yeah.
He's all done up. He's in his finest. He's wearing his ceremonial necklace, and he says he's looking forward to the day, as today will be the end of that heretic Queen's reign. We then see the Queen in private, trying to find the right words she's about to use in the House of Lords to get the bishops and the assembled bishops and lords to pass what she calls a unity act.
Yeah, that's a religious unity act.
Yeah,
so that's under one Church of England with one prayer book, not the Act of Union, which came in the early 1700s with England, Scotland and Wales.
Then we cut to the House of Lords where she's giving her speech. It's a pretty raucous place, and we see her imploring the Lords to work with her to pass the law recognising a single Church of England with a common hymn book and a common purpose. She presses her point with guile and humour.
Madam, by this act, you force us to relinquish our allegiance to the Holy Father.
How can I force you, Your Grace? I am a woman. I have no desire to make windows into men's souls. I simply ask, can any man, in truth, serve two masters and be faithful to both?
Madam, this is heresy. It is heresy indeed.
No, Your Grace, this is common sense, which is a most English virtue.
Norfolk is there to vote, as Walsingham, as always, watches on. Norfolk looks around for some bishops and lords that are missing. It turns out Walsingham has locked them up somewhere so they'll miss the vote. We jump back to the House of Lords. The bishops say all the Queen's problems would somehow disappear if she got married, presumably to the French or Spanish monarch, and then she'd have army and influence, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. Elizabeth replies, "Who? A Frenchman or a Spaniard, or perhaps both?" To which they laugh. She parries and thrusts with the best of the lords, and eventually, through her wit and personality, convinces a majority to support her proposal. Now the vote is done, we see Walsingham release the interred bishops and lords. He informs them that the Queen prevailed by 5 votes. The 6 prisoners slowly leave their temporary prison. It's a good scene.
It's a nicely done scene. Yeah, I've not been able to find anything.
I mean, neither.
That there was
a Unity Act that did get through.
Yeah, but I'm not sure it was that close, and I'm not sure Walsingham just locked people up, because you think, well, wouldn't someone would have said something? Yeah, I mean, just going back to the thing about the Duke of Anjou on the reality front and Burleigh, Lord Burleigh trying to promote him. He did, but again, this happened
much later,
decades after this, and he was a lot younger than Elizabeth when they were, meant to be
rumoured or trying to get together.
Yeah.
But we'll get to that again, I think.
However, back to the movie, and we see a lavish parade with lots of boats, and it's the French suitor, the Duke of Anjou, the French king's brother, arriving across a lake by a palace. It's very festive, but he looks a bit dour as Dudley, Walsingham, Norfolk and Burleigh look on. The Queen looks quite pleased to be the object of all this attention as the handsome Duke arrives, but just as she's about to receive him, it turns out to be a prank. The actual Duke is disguised as a piper, played very well by French actor Vincent Cassel. The Duke thinks it's a great joke, but Elizabeth is clearly not impressed with someone who she seems to look at as a buffoon. And he tries to kiss her, and he whispers some very, very lewd things in her ear. And the French ambassador looks embarrassed as the Queen's trying to control the situation by playing along, but she's clearly not comfortable. Suddenly, action switches to the Vatican, and we meet John Gielgud, who's playing the Pope, and he's receiving a priest from England, played by young Daniel Craig, and the priest's name is John Ballard. We'll come to him in a moment on the next reality check. But Ballard informs His Holiness that the Union Act has passed, and the Pope says he needs to pray on this disappointing news. Reality on John Ballard, he was a real Jesuit priest, and he did act as a messenger for the Vatican.
And plotter.
And he did come to England as an agent provocateur, although he came as a missionary, Catholic, he would have had a price on his head, so he actually came in disguise. And he got a couple of nicknames around court. He came as a sort of mercenary soldier type. So he wasn't an openly Catholic priest as we see him, and he's got a tonsure and he's got his cowl, and he goes around beating people to death, all the work of God, as interpreted by the 16th century Catholic Church. But John Ballard, real person. The Duke of Anjou, haven't been able to find anything that he was a buffoon and a lecher and a bit simple, bit of an idiot. But Elizabeth wasn't hugely impressed with him, supposedly.
But again, this was some 20 years later than what the film would suggest. We're back in the palace, and we see a lavish evening party on the lake. Maybe it's in honour of the visiting French Duke. We see all the guests gliding about the lake on their own rowboats, wearing Venetian-style masks for anonymity. Dudley and the Queen are sharing a boat where he professes his love for her as they coo to each other. Norfolk's there on his own boat, and watching from the bank is Walsingham. Fireworks and flaming fountains take off as Dudley asks the Queen to marry him. The Duke of Anjou and his ambassador are in their own boat. The Duke is jealous of Dudley's intimacy. The ambassador says that women are a mystery and you'll never unlock them, to which the Duke replies, unless you have a very big key. This amuses him and he yells, very big key, out several times. The Queen is coy about Dudley's marriage proposal, when Dudley suddenly realises that the Spanish ambassador, who's on his own boat, gliding around, is also a bishop, and perhaps he can marry the pair there and then. But before this light-hearted but also maybe serious proposal can proceed any further, an assassin's arrow fells one of the Queen's guards, and a second closely misses the Queen's head. Her attendants scramble to protect the Queen, and she's quickly returned to the palace under armed guard. Burleigh is there, as is Walsingham. Burleigh says no one is to enter the Queen's chambers. Dudley promptly appears and tries to enter, but he's stopped by Burleigh. The Spanish ambassador suddenly appears and wants a quiet word on the side with Dudley, while Walsingham dissects the assassination attempt with one of his colleagues.
Yeah, he's questioning it. Was it Norfolk or the Spanish? Walsingham says he'll play Norfolk's game, whatever that might be. Meanwhile, the Spanish ambassador tries to recruit Dudley to spy on Elizabeth for the Catholics. But Dudley's pretty, rebuffs him
loyal,
pretty firmly and walks off. The Queen is having blood removed from her clothes, not her blood, but the armed guard who fell across her. And Burleigh is still pressing her to choose a husband, just as the French ambassador appears to ensure she's all right, and to remind her he still wants an answer about her taking a French husband. The Queen sticks to her guns and dismisses the ambassador, as he tells her that her heart obviously belongs to another. Burleigh erupts at the Queen, saying her fornications with Dudley are an open secret. She can't possibly marry him as he's already married. And the shocked Queen falls silent. How's that on accuracy?
It's bad. Elizabeth did know Dudley was married all the way through their romance. His wife lived separately in their country manor, and she was trying to survive breast cancer. Whether she knew that the dalliance with the Queen, I don't know. Whether his wife did, but Elizabeth definitely knew that Dudley was married at the time, and it didn't deter her.
Yeah.
Dudley's wife died at the foot of the stairs in their country house before the cancer could get her, and there was talk after that Dudley and Elizabeth would marry, but that never happened.
Yeah, and I did read that Dudley's wife, was it suicide? Was it
an accident?
Was it an accident, or was it a push?
Yeah.
And by either Dudley himself, or although he seems to have rarely visited her, or a servant. But the inquest at the time recorded an accidental death.
But it would have been seen as bad form for Elizabeth to marry Dudley. It looked too convenient that they might have a hand in it, so she couldn't go there. So
probably, if it was Dudley had anything to do with it, he to help him marry Elizabeth, it would backfired massively.
Yeah,
she'd
exactly.
have been, I can't do that now.
So in the movie, we're back to the Queen's court, probably the next day. Dudley walks in. The court seems to stare at him, and suddenly the Queen is announced. She walks past the throng, while all of the courtiers before her kneel. Norfolk manages a slightly less respectful bow of the head. The Queen makes no acknowledgement to the kneeling Dudley.
Yeah. We then get some kind of pantomime play where several men are dressed as ships, which is probably the easiest way to describe it.
Yeah,
sort of,
each one of them is dressed as their own ship of the Spanish fleet.
And then they're being brought, or they're being captured by a single man dressed as a sole British pirate ship. The Spanish ambassador is really not impressed. He complains to Norfolk that his king is becoming impatient with Elizabeth.
He also accused Norfolk of trying to further Norfolk's own ambitions, and maybe Norfolk is seeking to marry the Queen. Norfolk denies this, of course, and as always, Walsingham is watching in the wings. Elizabeth is seated with the French ambassador, so for the third or fourth time we have a scene where the Queen is present with several powerful men from Europe and England, all hoping to get the better of her one way or another. And again, none of them do. She says that she will give her answer directly to the Duke of Anjou. There and then, the Queen and the French ambassador, plus a small entourage, get up from the light-hearted performance, go to another part of the palace and enter the Duke's chambers, where perhaps predictably he has his own party going, or is that better described as an orgy?
That's right, because she said to the ambassador, what a shame he couldn't attend our party, and he said, he's feeling very unwell, he has indigestion problems, so he sent me in his stead.
That's right.
Which is, I get watching the film, not a reality check here, because I have no idea how real this particular scene was, but watching the movie I thought, either she thinks he's bluffing, let's go and catch him out, or Walsingham told her exactly what was going on.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So they interrupt the Duke of Anjou's orgy.
The giggling Duke is in bed, dressed as a noblewoman. When he's challenged about this, he sees nothing unusual, as this is how he often dresses in private when he's with friends. An amused Elizabeth offers him her hand to kiss, which he begrudgingly does, before Elizabeth respectfully declines his offer of marriage and leaves. Yeah, we're pretty sure that the Duke of Anjou wasn't a cross-dresser.
No. Well, he may have been, but there's nothing recorded about it. And again,
it is a good scene, I'll give him that.
She was a lot older by the time she actually encountered him.
Yep.
And
in her 40s, I think.
As we'll come to, she wasn't unwise, even as a young woman.
No.
So, back at her own party, the Queen puts Burghley in his place by saying there will be no more talk of marriage. And she has a good line for him, doesn't she? She says something that none of the marriages you're proposing involve me not giving England away to a foreign king, basically. So she's amused by the whole affair and starts laughing and then asks Dudley to dance. Like the lance dance they had together, there's lots of clapping and whirling about, but there is a bit of tension between them. Dudley tries to explain his situation to you. She asks him if he loves his wife. He says, no, I only love you. You're my Elizabeth.
For God's sake, you are still my Elizabeth.
I am not your Elizabeth. I am no man's Elizabeth. And if you think to rule her, you are mistaken. I will have one mistress here, and no master!
So again, a man has tried to get the better of her and failed. We then see a bitter, humiliated Dudley doing a sort of I'm better off without her anyway routine with the Spanish ambassador. The ambassador offers Dudley a way to get back in Elizabeth's good graces by protecting her from Norfolk's murderous hand. Dudley seems too bitter to think that this is a good idea.
We cut back to the Pope in the Vatican. He's approving a decree or a papal bull which will free Elizabeth's subjects from obeying her and offers a place in heaven to any man who assassinates her. It's effectively a fatwa, isn't it? A papal decree. Daniel Craig's priest, John Ballard, takes the decree for delivery to England. On the English coast, we see him arrive with the decree to be met on the shore by Norfolk and his men. It's also the Earl of Sussex there, I think. Mm-hmm. Ballard ignores Norfolk and accuses one of his men of being a spy for Walsingham. And we realise it's the young man we saw discussing matters with Walsingham earlier, so clearly he is. Ballard wrestles the spy to the water and beats him to death with a rock, leaving the body to wash out with the tide. And this is wearing his monk's monk's cowl and everything. Yeah. So he's obviously a pretty robust Jesuit priest.
Okay, we're back in the Queen's chambers. We see her attendants fussing over her beautiful dresses. We quickly cut to Norfolk's room, where we learn that Daniel Craig's priest has been having a no doubt conspiratorial conversation with Norfolk and the Spanish ambassador. Then we cut to a raunchy sex scene with Dudley and one of the Queen's attendants, who just now had been trying on the Queen's dresses. As she's about to climax, the Queen's attendant starts to scream in pain. She collapses and it looks like she's about to die in agony. Then they cut to the Queen alone. I think she's looking for her missing attendant. As we see the angry priest, John Ballard, marching threateningly towards her. He stopped in his tracks as a hysterical attendant and a guard appeared, dragging the Queen to the grisly scene of her dead handmaiden, dressed in one of Elizabeth's fine frocks. Burghley is quickly on the scene and informs the Queen that the dress had somehow been poisoned. Clearly that grisly death in front of them was meant for Elizabeth. The dress, we learn, was a gift, but we don't learn from who.
No, I mean, a little wrap-up on that bit.
Yeah.
Not so much reality, but just on the editing. Because Elizabeth says, but that dress was a gift. And I'm thinking,
from?
Now she's going to say who it was from, and we never find that out. So
yeah, and even that glimpse of John Ballard, the priest, that looked very strange. Looked like it was just dropped in after the fact or something, because he's there for a second, looked like he's going to kill her, because he's almost within reach, and then suddenly he just turns left and disappears, you know?
Because the armed guards arrived to escort.
It was a bit clunky, I thought.
Yeah, although interestingly, I just trailed this on Twitter a couple of days ago, and Cheetown Paddy, who's been very kind to us in his words before, he said he's pretty sure that's Daniel Craig's first sort of, not
named
major
role,
but named role. And you do see that purposeful stride, and he's walking through and he crosses himself. He does the
sign of the cross,
the sign of the cross, as a Catholic priest would have done. And yet he's got knives and swords and things. You think, wow, it's a really powerful scene. But yeah, you think, well, how's he got into the royal palace dressed as a Jesuit priest, which kind of would be a bit of a...
I mean, there is
a red flag.
The criticism of the movie that you get is that they don't actually give any cloth to all these threats around, and we don't quite know what they are. They don't... And it's because in the movie, as we've already said, they've compressed many years into the early reign where she was threatened by different empires at different times, different European rulers at different times, and they just throw them all in there all at once. There are some French troops in Scotland, but there's no one massing about to invade the country, and yet she has to act. It's all just left a little bit vague, they say.
Yeah, I think possibly at this stage it was the case of people were trying to take advantage of her through a marriage to a king or a king's brother or whatever, and maybe the frustration with her grew until the point they did want to invade later on. But yeah, it's almost like the first 40 years of her 50-year reign are compressed into
the first
45 years,
a couple of months at the start of her reign almost.
So we then cut to night time in Scotland, where the rather laughable Duke of Anjou is meeting with Walsingham and Mary of Guise. Mary points out that Elizabeth has no friends and she's in a precarious position. Walsingham says that she was too hasty, dismissing the foppish Duke of Anjou, who suggests that Elizabeth is frigid and perhaps even a man. Mary tells him to go away so she and Walsingham can get down to some real negotiations. And then she does start making kind of sexy eyes as Walsingham confesses, "Look, I'm not a fool. It's only a matter of time until Elizabeth is replaced." He says it would be a wise man who would decide to change allegiances at such a time. Mary of Guise looks very interested in that. He says the choice is, does he get into bed with Spain or with France? Which of these would he prefer? And there's a silence, but there are gazes towards each other, which kind of tell you which way
flirty
she's
eyes.
going to try and persuade him. So,
next we're back in England, where Dudley seeks a private discussion with the Queen, where he tells her that she's in mortal danger, but she can be saved by a friend in the form of the King of Spain. So it seems Dudley has indeed thrown his lot in with the Spanish. Elizabeth would need to marry the Spanish king and move from England. Dudley says he wants this because he loves her, and even though he won't see her, it's the only way to protect her. Elizabeth is not impressed, saying that Dudley might make one of her ladies a whore, but he won't make Elizabeth one. And we see a chastened Dudley leave.
Back in Scotland, we have Henry, the Duke of Anjou, very distraught, cursing Elizabeth and the devil servant Walsingham, because overnight, presumably whilst they shared a bed, Walsingham has somehow managed to murder Mary of Guise and flee back to England.
None of which they showed us, we had to infer that.
Yeah, the Duke mourns over Mary's dead, naked body, and then we see Elizabeth casually over a meal deny any knowledge of the murder to Burghley. Walsingham is present and says nothing when Elizabeth says, "I never ordered it." Burley now replies it'll be even more dependent on the Spanish for her safety because the French will be completely alienated. But Elizabeth pushes back, saying England is not to be part of France or Spain, and going forward she will follow her own counsel. She says, I'm not merely a woman, but I'm my father's daughter. Burley is beaten and apologises to the more and more confident monarch. She then tells him that she's giving him a lordship, so he'll be able to enjoy his retirement in comfort. And he realises he's basically been pensioned off. And he leaves Elizabeth with Walsingham, clearly her only trusted advisor.
Walsingham then gives Elizabeth some Machiavellian advice. The prince should never flinch from doing what is necessary to protect the state. He continues saying that he's aware of the Vatican-sanctioned priest.
With powerful, this is John Ballard he's referring to.
With powerful letters from the Pope.
Yeah.
And he's about, and he's a threat to Elizabeth. This shouldn't be news to Elizabeth, who's already seen the priest at close quarters. Walsingham says that Norfolk is behind the plot, gathering forces abroad to overwhelm Elizabeth. She tells Walsingham to find the priest and those that would harm her. Walsingham and his men immediately raid some lord's house. I couldn't quite figure out who the lord was, but they only find women and children there. Lord A started with an A.
Yeah, Altrincham, Aylesbury.
Shorter. I played it many times. I couldn't quite pick up.
Yep.
Anyway, one of clearly a Catholic lord, and they only find women and children there. Walsingham immediately turns to a hidden latch on the wall, which reveals a hidden room where the priest Ballard is saying Catholic Mass to a couple of worshippers. We then see Walsingham torturing Ballard for information on his co-conspirators. It's a really gruesome scene, but eventually Ballard cracks. As we see in the next scene, Elizabeth is reviewing some papers as Walsingham lists out a name of Catholic traitors. The last name he lists is that of Robert Dudley, the Queen's one-time lover. Walsingham also shares the Pope's letters to Norfolk, encouraging Norfolk to marry Mary Queen of Scots and claim the English throne. The determined Queen orders Walsingham to have Norfolk show his hand as a traitor.
Yeah.
There's a lot in that.
Yeah, there is. Well, Mary of Guise died of natural causes and not... In fact, was it her who died of the edema? I'm not sure. Rather than...
I don't remember. Oh, no, she died of something else, but it was natural causes.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people did die of natural causes there. There was no antibiotics and there was not that much in the way of medical science. And her death happened about a year later than the film suggests, so not by Walsingham's hand. Burley was not dismissed or pensioned off and remained part of the court until he died a few years later. And as you pointed out, he was only 13 years older. Yeah, this was something quite interesting. Now, Walsingham, the character in the movie, mentions the prince, a prince, or princes several times.
Yeah, defending their realm.
This is only 10, 15 years after Machiavelli's The Prince was published, after his death. In 1532, I think they published The Prince, which is where we get the phrase, Machiavelli, the adjective Machiavellian from, meaning to be ruthless. And one of his pieces of advice in the Prince is get your dirty work done early. And this movie is kind of implying that that's exactly what Elizabeth did. But I do wonder I would imagine someone as politically astute and who'd studied in Italy, such as Walsingham, quite likely had read Machiavelli's works, but I've got no evidence of that.
That's a good suggestion, though.
I was just thinking, I did look up, and it's certainly when they were published by the family that they were immediate hits, because I was wondering if it was like, Van Gogh, who never sold a painting during his lifetime.
Right.
And maybe it was much later they were discovered, but no, so it would have been around.
And the bit about Dudley being a traitor to the Queen, they've taken a lot of licence there.
Yeah, no, he wasn't.
Dudley remained part of the Queen's court for many, many years, and he was never mistrusted, and he certainly wasn't part of this or any other Catholic plot. She continued to enjoy his company, and even helped keep his second marriage a secret for some reason. So they remained firm friends, if not more, well after the action in the movie.
Yeah, and also the John Ballard character, who's tortured to death towards the end and gives it away, he was sent across, but as I think we mentioned earlier, this was in the 1880s, the 1580s.
So 20 plus years later?
Yeah, at least.
For a different conspiracy.
For the, I think it's the Babington conspiracy.
I'll defer to
and he had an assistant who was he was an Englishman who studied and became a Jesuit priest, and he had an assistant who accompanied him all around England, and that assistant was a spy for Walsingham.
Right.
and that's how they knew everything was going on. Basically, Walsingham had his hand on it all, and they did implicate several nobles, including the Duke of Norfolk, but not now, at this stage.
Yeah. And we're just about to move on to another scene, and I think we missed something in the notes, and there was a key scene earlier where Norfolk gives these important papal letters to his mistress for delivery.
Yes.
He signs them and agrees that he'll, do the Pope's bidding.
His mistress, who is a lady in waiting to the Queen, so Norfolk thinks he's got a spy in the Queen's camp.
Yeah, okay, so just bear that in mind as we go to the next scene.
Yes. So the next scene being Norfolk telling his mistress that the future will forgive him for what he's about to do, and he signs the Pope's instructions to marry Mary and grab the crown.
Oh, there we go. We're falling over ourselves.
Yeah.
It seems that Mary's mistress may in fact be in cahoots with Walsingham, as we suspect she's about to deliver the incriminating letter to him. We briefly see the Spanish ambassador, before we then see the troops gathering their arms under Walsingham's watchful eye. Then Elizabeth, we see her praying in a church. Norfolk is in bed with his mistress, and we see someone self-flagellating themselves into a bloody mess. I think that's a sort of a mark about what's to happen within Elizabeth's England.
The guy self-flagellating is the one-eyed bishop. He's got a milky eye, and he's the staunchly Catholic
interrogator of
Elizabeth earlier in the movie. Yeah, then we see the killings and the arrests start. A couple of anonymous nobles are stabbed. Another one cops it whilst that's the Earl of Sussex.
On the crapper.
And I can't remember the actor's name. The guy who plays him normally appears in like Cockney gangster movies.
Right.
Comedies or black comedies, as they may be. But he's just not even arrested, is he? He's just killed.
On the spot.
And the flagellator. A Catholic couple flee, leaving their children behind, or hide. And next we see the Spanish ambassador, dead, with blood trickling from his mouth.
Now, that's not true. No, it would have been a great offence to kill an ambassador on British soil.
He was sent home.
Yeah.
He was deported. Just when the eventual plot
later on came out.
Yeah.
Back in the movie, while Elizabeth is kneeling in prayer, Norfolk is in his bedroom with his mistress, and he's confronted by half a dozen troops and Walsingham, and he shows him that Pope's letter that he had signed earlier and handed to his mistress. Norfolk turns to her, and she says nothing.
What is the meaning of this?
Your Grace is arrested. You must go with these men to the Tower.
I must do nothing by your orders. I am Norfolk.
You were Norfolk. The dead have no titles. You were the most powerful man in England. Greater still, but you had not the courage to be loyal. Only the conviction of your own vanity.
I think, Walsingham, a man's courage is in the manner of his death. I am content to die for my beliefs, so cut off my head and make me a martyr. The people will always remember it.
No. They will forget.
Then we see Elizabeth before a condemned couple in their prison cell. It's that couple earlier we saw leaving their children.
Arundel.
Oh, good on you.
Arundel. Sure, it's the Earl of Arundel, yeah.
Okay. So Elizabeth's before this couple in the cell, and she tells them not to worry about their abandoned children, as she can recall some earlier kindness. And we realise this must be the fellow who insisted on Elizabeth taking his coat when she herself was imprisoned. She turns around and leaves them in their cells, so she says she'll look after their kids, but she's not going to free them by the looks of things.
Elizabeth and Walsingham confront Dudley, who's been waiting for arrest. Elizabeth asks Dudley why he betrayed her, and he says it's no easy thing to love the Queen, and it would corrupt the soul of any man, and then says, kill me. Despite Walsingham's protestations, Elizabeth decides Dudley should live, as a constant reminder as to how close she came to mortal danger. There's a couple of mournful looks between the two former lovers, and Elizabeth leaves Dudley, who is now a broken man.
Next, we see Norfolk's beheading, and then his head is put on a spike, together with the heads of some fellow conspirators.
Then we see Elizabeth praying in church with Walsingham before a statue of Mary, the mother of Jesus. She says she's now freed England from her enemies, but what can she do next? Does she need to be made of stone and live alone for the sake of her rule? Walsingham seems to agree, telling her that all men need something greater than themselves to look up to worship. They must be able to touch the divine even here on earth. Walsingham suggests she would be a suitable replacement for the Virgin Mary. So Elizabeth has her lovely long hair cut off, her face and hands whitened like a statue. Then we see some flashbacks to the bitter and sweet parts of her life as depicted in the movie. And then looking very pale and boyish, in a move to make her look unwomanly and plain, she says, "Look, I have become a virgin."
Why don't we just circle back on some of those things?
Yeah, well, as we said, Norfolk was executed, but a couple of decades later, and it was for collaborating with the King of Spain, and that was in the lead up to the invasion that became the Spanish Armada. Yeah.
And we've already said that Dudley was a friend in the court and was never a traitor, and never had his life, at least in Elizabeth's hands. And the bit about taking inspiration from the statue of the Virgin Mary, and becoming statuesque herself and plain and white, that's all invented. That never ever happened. Elizabeth was known for whitening her face, but that was much later in life after she survived a smallpox infection and her skin had become disfigured slightly, so she had to mask the skin.
Yeah, I mean the business of this, was she a virgin, wasn't she a virgin? I mean, that's based on the fact that she never married.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know, to suggest that means that she never lost her virginity.
But it was good PR for her at the time to promote these sorts of things, I guess, that she was only married to England and, didn't need a man to make her legitimate.
But there's also, I mean, I'm trying to think which novels it was I read. It might be the... what's her name? The Wolf Hall, Hilary Mantel.
Hilary Mantel, yeah.
But about Walsingham, and Elizabeth does seem to have lost her patience with him a lot of times.
Right.
But she so valued his advice. She found him impertinent, but she also loved his impertinence and his sarcasm and his wit, which could be quite caustic. But if he disagreed with her, she could lose her temper, and she'd never threatened him with his life, I don't think, but she'd banish him and then call him back, and he just seems to have been able to read her. But this idea that it is portrayed a little bit, particularly at the beginning of the film, that
she's a naive ingenue, and all these men are running rings around her initially, and they're outfoxing her.
It's almost
like
she bats them away just through wit. But she was brought up at her father's knee, and she watched how all this worked.
She could speak French, English,
Latin,
Greek, and she knew all of the Celtic languages around. She could speak Welsh, and she was learning them. So she was a clever cookie.
Very, very clever woman, very
capable,
strong-willed, and and again, this wasn't historical fiction; it was a history book. I can't remember when I read it, that Henry, knowing that his eldest daughter Mary, if he couldn't produce another son, which was why he went through so many wives so rapidly later in his life, if he couldn't produce a son heir, then Mary was going to take over, and she was a Catholic. But he knew all along, supposedly, that Elizabeth was a far more capable woman,
potential
ruler. So she was prepared for this.
Yeah, she gets there in the end in the movie, but she was very much more prepared for it when it actually happened.
So back to the movie and the final scenes.
She presents herself to the court, walking in bathed in white light. The court present includes Burleigh and Dudley. Everybody present bows before this ghostly figure. She shows her left hand to Burleigh.
Observe, Lord Burleigh. I am married to England.
She then takes her place on the throne, and everyone, including Walsingham, is transfixed. Text on the screen appears to inform us that Elizabeth reigned for another 40 years. Walsingham remained her most trusted advisor to the end. Elizabeth never married, and never saw Dudley in private again. On her deathbed, we're told she is said to have whispered Dudley's name. At the time of her death, England, we're told, had entered a golden age and had become the most powerful and successful country in Europe. Roll credits.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's some brilliant performances in the film. It really is. If you want to have a gripping costume drama, that's a really good one to watch. I would recommend the film.
It's great to watch. It's a beautiful movie.
There's some really nice surprises as well. Eric Cantona's pretty good as the French ambassador.
Yeah.
He was a heck of a footballer, but he's also not a bad actor. He's been in a few other things since then. I just think the compressing of time.
We're back to that observation, aren't we?
Which sometimes you can understand. I mean, Hidden Figures, which is the one we probably keep going back to on that. It makes sense and it doesn't detract anything with the story, but this is getting lots of different threads and putting them all into one event, which didn't actually happen the way it should.
And I've not seen the sequel with the same cast, which was made some years later. It's got worse reviews than this one, but I'm figuring out how can they make the sequel when everything that should have happened in the sequel is happening in the first one.
I think they'll probably just repeat the plot, but with different names and actors. I don't know. But very strange. I mean, I think the Walsingham character would be great to have a movie about him.
On him.
Because I'm surprised. I'm trying to think, does he appear in any of the ones I can think of around that time? Other than him himself. He's always going to be a supporting actor, but and he used code books, he used double agents, and although he didn't leave much in the way, he didn't write anything down as a guidebook. He inspired a lot of future generations. Things that to us nowadays, with official governmental spy agencies, we think of as basic tools of the trade for them. He kind of not invented necessarily, but he certainly brought them all together and used them effectively.
And just to wrap up some of the other major characters, Elizabeth reigned for 40 years. She died in 1603, a very successful monarch. Dudley stayed close to her his whole life, and he played a key figure in the defence of England against the Spanish for the Battle of the Armada. And he was unwell at the time and died soon afterwards. He'd been unwell as a result of the battle, I think, and other things, and he died. At that point, the Queen, she retained the last note he ever wrote to her, put it in a treasure box, and it stayed there till she died.
Wow.
Yeah, so they really got that wrong. They really did Dudley a disservice in this movie, didn't they?
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's virtually no mention of Mary Queen of Scots, who was
in the movie.
In the I think it's Babington Conspiracy is the name it was given,
right?
Which is the one that involved John Ballard and
20
Duke
years
of Norfolk.
later.
That was the one that implicated Mary Queen of Scots, who was she was a prisoner in the Midlands then,
right?
And that's what led Elizabeth to decide her to actually execute her,
and
which she then did.
And wrapping up the Duke of Anjou, he was not in line for the French throne. He had an older brother that became the king, and he was given a supporting role in Europe. He became the king of Poland and Lithuania.
Oh, right.
But then his older brother died unexpectedly, and the foppish, silly Duke in this movie became the King of France and was a successful ruler for some time before he was assassinated by a Dominican monk that was crazed. So he had a very interesting life as well.
John Ballard comes back again.
Yes.
So entertainment.
Let's go to the easy one.
I think it's 7.
I got 8. I really liked it. I'm a bit biased because it's got a couple of major Australian actors in there doing a very, very good job.
Some brilliant performances. Yeah, I'm going to go 7.
History. Are we going to give it a fail? Less than 5?
Yeah,
I think so. I think 3.
No, better than 3.
4.
Yeah, 3 would be like Gladiator, where the only thing they just got a few names right, I think.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, good point.
I was thinking 5, because a lot of the names are right, and some of what happened to them and what they did was right.
Okay, well, let's go with a 5, a D-. It's a very close fail, but not quite.
Yeah.
Okay. So what's up next, Martin?
Now, next
we're on other sides of the world.
Is Braveheart. So
tell us about Braveheart.
We're going even further back in time, because Braveheart was the first, or was the movie that inspired the idea of doing this one day.
History by Hollywood.
It's and I hope people can forgive me my Englishness, especially if you're Scottish. I'm not going to be rude about the film as a standalone film. If it had made up country names, it's just a classic Magnificent Seven, Star Wars style, good guys against bad guys movie.
Yeah.
With a hero, a self-sacrifice. Gladiator.
Yeah.
I'm sure Gladiator took some inspiration from it. The real story of William Wallace is fascinating, and there's much about him that as a man you have to admire. Would have made a great movie. And not necessarily as a political leader, because he was so stubborn, but that's probably what people admire most about him. But a lot of myths have grown up about him, often through the movie, and that's why we came to this. But also myths about other key historical figures that we'll meet during that examination.
Yes.
And that will be our last one before Christmas and the New Year. And we'll be taking a month. Yeah, we're going to skip one fortnightly slot. And we'll get lots of research done. And then we're back with Goodfellas.
Goodfellas, yeah.
So a total change of direction.
Which is good.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for your time, guys.
Hope you enjoyed it. And we will speak to you next time.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Fight and you may die. Run and you'll live. At least a while. And dying in your beds many years from now, would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom! Abba! Gabra!